Section 27 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Stories from Pliny. How Dogs Love. Now there was living at Rome, under the emperors Vespasian and Titus, AD 69 to 81, a man called Pliny, who gave up his life to the study of animals and plants. He not only watched their habits for himself, but he listened eagerly to all that travelers would tell him, and sometimes happened to believe too much, and wrote in his book things that were not true. Still, there were a great many facts which he had found out for himself, and the stories he tells about animals are of interest to everyone, partly because it seems strange to think that dogs and horses and other creatures were just the same then as they are now. The dogs that Pliny writes about lived in all parts of the Roman Empire and were as faithful and devoted to their masters as our dogs are to us. One dog, called Hyrcanus, belonging to King Lysimachus, one of the successors of Alexander the Great, jumped onto the funeral pyre on which lay burning the dead body of his master. And so did another dog at the burial of Hero of Syracuse. But during the lifetime of Pliny himself, a dog's devotion in the heart of Rome had touched even the Roman citizens, ashamed though they generally were of showing their feelings. It had happened that a plot against the life of Nero had been discovered, and the chief conspirator, Titus Sabinus by name, was put to death, together with some of his servants. One of these men had a dog, of which he was very fond, and from the moment the man was thrown into prison, the dog could not be persuaded to move away from the door. At last there came a day when the man suffered the cruel death common in Rome for such offenses, and was thrown down a steep flight of stairs, where he broke his neck. A crowd of Romans had gathered round the place of execution in order to see the sight, and in the midst of them all the dog managed to reach his master's side and lay there, howling piteously. Then one of the crowd, moved with pity, threw the dog a piece of meat, but he only took it and laid it across his master's mouth. By and by, the men came for the body in order to throw it into the river Tiber, and even then the dog followed and swam after it, and held it up and tried to bring it to land, till the people came out in multitudes from the houses round about to see what it was to be faithful unto death, and beyond it. End of section 27. Recording by Maricel Cui.
Section 28 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner, Ballyclare. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Kenyatte Menagerie en Theme. In the early part of this century, a little boy of 3 years old, Philofie Gautier, travelled with his parents from Tarbes in the south of France to Paris. He was so small that he could not speak any proper French, but talked like the country people, and he divided the world into those who spoke like him and were his friends, and those who did not and were strangers. But though he was only 3 and a great baby in many ways, he loved his home dearly and everything about it, and it nearly broke his heart to come away. His parents tried to comfort him by giving him the most beautiful chocolates and little cakes, and when that failed, they tried what drums and trumpets would do. But drums and trumpets succeeded no better than cakes and chocolates, for the greater part of poor Théophile's tears were shed for the dog he had left behind him, called Kenyatte. which his father had given away to a friend, as he did not think that any dog who had been accustomed to run along the hills and valleys above Tarbes could ever make himself happy in Paris. Théophile, however, did not understand this, but cried for Cagnotte all day long, and one morning he could bear it no longer. His nurse had put out all his tin soldiers neatly on the table, with a little German village surrounded by stiff green trees just in front of them, hoping Théophile might play at a battle or a siege, and she had also placed his fiddle, which was painted bright scarlet, quite handy, so that he might play the triumphal march of the victor. Nothing was of any use. As soon as Josephine's back was turned, Théophile threw soldiers and village and fiddle out of the window, and then prepared to jump after them, so that he might take the shortest way back to Tarbes and Cagnotte. Luckily, just as his foot was on the sill, Josephine came back from the next room and saw what he was about. She rushed after him and caught him by the jacket, and then took him on her knee and asked him why he was going to do anything so naughty and dangerous. When Théophile explained that it was Cagnotte whom he wanted and must have, and that nobody else mattered at all, Josephine was so afraid he would try to run away again that she told him that if he would only have patience and wait a little, Cagnotte would come to him. All day long Théophile gave Josephine no peace. Every few minutes he came running to his nurse to know if Cagnotte had arrived, and he was only quieted when Josephine went out and returned, carrying a little dog, which in some ways was very like his beloved Cagnotte. Théophile was not quite satisfied at first, till he remembered that Cagnotte had travelled a long, long way, and it was not to be expected that he should look the same dog as when he started. So he put aside his doubts and knelt down to give Cagnotte a great hug of welcome. The new Cagnotte, like the old, was a lovely black poodle, and had excellent manners, besides being full of fun. He licked Théophile on both cheeks, and was altogether so friendly that he was ready to eat bread and butter off the same plate as his little master. The two got on beautifully, and were perfectly happy for some time. And then gradually Cagnotte began to lose his spirits, and instead of jumping and running about the world, he moved slowly, as if he was in pain. He breathed slowly and heavily, and refused to eat anything, and even Théophile could see he was feeling ill. One day Cagnotte was lying stretched out on his master's lap, and Théophile was softly stroking his skin, when suddenly his hand caught in what seemed to be string or strong thread. In great surprise, Josephine was at once called to explain the strange matter. She stooped down and peered closely at the dog's skin, then took her scissors and cut the thread. Cagnotte stretched herself, gave a shake, and jumped down from Théophile's lap, leaving a sort of black sheepskin behind him. Some wicked men had sewn him up in this coat, so that they might get more money for him, and without it he was not a poodle at all, but just an ugly little street dog, without beauty of any kind. After helping to eat Théophile's bread and butter and soup for some weeks, Cagnotte began to grow fatter, and his outside skin became too tight for him, and he was nearly suffocated. Once delivered from it, he shook his ears for joy and danced a waltz of his own round the room, not caring a straw how ugly he might be as long as he was comfortable. A very few weeks spent in the society of Cagnotte made the memory of Tarbes and its mountains grow dim in the mind of Théophile. He learnt French and forgot the way the country people talked, and soon he had become, thanks to Cagnotte, such a thorough little Parisian that he would not have understood what his old friends said if one of them had spoken to him. End of section 28. Recording by Chad Horner, Ballyclare.
Section 29 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paula Messina. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Still Waters Run Deep, or The Dancing Dog by Théophile Gautier. Menagerie Intime. When little Théophile became big Théophile, he was as fond as ever of dogs and cats, and he knew more about them than anybody else. After the death of a large white spaniel called Luther, he filled a vacant place on his rug by another of the same breed, to whom he gave the name of Zamore. Zamore was a little dog, as black as ink, except for 2 yellow patches over his eyes and a stray patch on his chest. He was not in the least handsome, and no stranger would ever have given him a second thought. But when you came to know him, you found Zamore was not a common dog at all. He despised all women, and absolutely refused to obey them or to follow them, and neither Théophile's mother nor his sisters could get the smallest sign of friendship from him. If they offered him cakes or sugar, he would accept them in a dignified manner, but never dreamed of saying "thank you," still less of wagging his tail on the floor, or giving little yaps of delight and gratitude, as well-brought-up dogs should do. Even to Théophile's father, whom he liked better than anyone else, he was cold and respectful, though he followed him everywhere, and never left his master's heels when they took a walk. And when they were fishing together, Zamore would sit silent on the bank for hours together, and only allowed himself one bark when the fish was safely hooked. Now no one could possibly have guessed that a dog of such very quiet and reserved manners was at heart as gay and cheerful as the silliest kitten that ever was born. But so he was, and this was how his family found it out. One day he was walking as seriously as usual through a broad square in the outskirts of Paris, when he was surprised at meeting a large grey donkey, with 2 panniers on its back, and in the panniers a troop of dogs, some dressed as Swiss shepherdesses, some as Turks, some in full court costume. The owner of the animals stopped the donkey close to where Zamore was standing, and bade the dogs jump down. Then he cracked his whip, the fife and drum struck up a merry tune, the dogs steadied themselves on their hind legs, and the dance began. Zamore looked on as if he had been turned into stone. The sight of these dogs, dressed in bright colors, this one with his head covered by a feathered hat, and that one by a turban, but all moving about in time to the music, and making pirouettes and little bows. Were they really dogs he was watching, or some new kind of men? Anyway, he had never seen anything so enchanting or so beautiful. And if it was true that they were only dogs, well, he was a dog too. With that thought, all that had lain hidden in Zamore's soul burst forth, and when the dancers filed gracefully before him, he raised himself on his hind legs, and in spite of staggering a little, prepared to join the ring, to the great amusement of the spectators. The dog owner, however, whose name was Monsieur Cory, did not see matters in the same light. He raised his whip a second time, and brought it down with a crack on the sides of Zamore, who ran out of the ring, and with his tail between his legs and an air of deep thought, he returned home. All that day Zamore was more serious and more gloomy than ever. Nothing would tempt him out, hardly even his favorite dinner, and it was quite plain that he was turning over something in his mind. But during the night his 2 young mistresses were awakened by a strange noise that seemed to come from an empty room next theirs, where Zamore usually slept. They both lay awake and listened, and thought it was like a measured stamping, and that the mice might be giving a ball. But could little mice feet tread so heavily as that? Supposing a thief had got in? So the bravest of the 2 girls got up, and stealing to the door softly, opened it and looked into the room. And what do you think she saw? Why, Zamore on his hind legs, his paws in the air, practicing carefully the steps that he had been watching that morning. This was not, as one might have expected, a mere fancy of the moment, which would be quite forgotten the next day. Zamore was too serious a dog for that, and by dint of hard study he became in time a beautiful dancer. As often as the fife and drum were heard in the streets, Zamore rushed out of the house, glided softly between the spectators, and watched with absorbed attention the dancing dogs who were doing their steps. But remembering the blow he had had from the whip, he took care not to join them. He noted their positions, the figures, the way they held their bodies, and in the night he copied them, though by day he was just as solemn as ever. Soon he was not contented with merely copying what he saw. He invented for himself, and it is only just to say that, in stateliness of step, few dogs could come up to him. Often his dances were witnessed, unknown to himself, by Théophile and his sisters, who watched him through the crack of the door, and so earnest was he that at length, worn out by dancing, he would drink up the whole of a large basin of water which stood in the corner of the room. When Zamore felt himself the equal of the best of the dancing dogs, he began to wish that, like them, he might have an audience. Now in France the houses are not always built in a row as they are in England, but sometimes have a square courtyard in front, and in the house where Zamore lived, this court was shut in on one side by an iron railing, which was wide enough to let dogs of a slim figure squeeze through. One fine morning there met in this courtyard 15 or 20 dogs, friends of Zamore, to whom the night before he had sent letters of invitation. The object of the party was to see Zamore make his debut in dancing, and the ballroom was to be the courtyard, which Zamore had carefully swept with his tail. The dance began, and the spectators were so delighted that they could not wait for the end to applaud, as people ought always to do, but uttered loud cries of "Wow, wow!" that reminded you of the noises you hear at a theatre, except one old water spaniel, who was filled with envy at Zamore's talents, and declared that no decent dog would ever make an exhibition of himself like that. They all vowed that Zamore was the king of dancers, and that nothing had ever been seen to equal his minuet, jig, and waltz for grace and beauty. It was only during his dancing moments that Zamore unbent. At all other times he was as gloomy as ever, and never cared to stir from the rug unless he saw his old master take up his hat and stick for a walk. Of course, if he had chosen, he might have joined Monsieur Cory's troupe, of which he would have made the brightest ornament. But the love of his master proved greater than his love of his art, and he remained unknown, except of his family. In the end he fell a victim to his passion for dancing, and he died of brain fever, which is supposed to have been caused by the fatigue of learning the schottische, the fashionable dance of the day. Reader, Paula Messina. Section 29 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Section 30 of The Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Jarrow. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Theo and His Horses, Jane, Betsy, and Blanche, by Théophile Gautier. From Menagerie Intime. After Théophile grew to be a man, he wrote a great many books, which are all delightful to read, and everybody bought them. And Théophile got rich, and thought he might give himself a little carriage with 2 horses to draw it. And first he fell in love with two dear little Shetland ponies, who were so shaggy and hairy that they seemed all mane and tail, and whose eyes looked so affectionately at him that he felt as if he should like to bring them into the drawing-room instead of sending them to the stable. They were charming little creatures, not a bit shy, and they would come and poke their noses into Theophil's pockets in search for sugar, which was always there. Indeed, their only fault was that they were so very, very small, and that, after all, was not their fault. Still, they looked more suited to an English child of 8 years old, or to Tom Thumb, than to a French gentleman of 40, not so thin as he once was. And as they all passed through the streets, everybody laughed, and drew pictures of them, and declared that Théophile could easily have carried a pony on each arm and the carriage on his back. Now Théophile did not mind being laughed at, but still he did not always want to be stared at all through the streets whenever he went out. So he sold his ponies and began to look out for something nearer his own size. After a short search, he found two of a dapple gray color, stout and strong, and as like each other as two peas, and he called them Jane and Betsy. But although to look at, no one could ever tell one from the other, their characters were totally different, as Jane was very bold and spirited, and Betsy was terribly lazy. While Jane did all the pulling, Betsy was quite contented to just run by her side without troubling herself in the least, and, as was only natural, Jane did not think this at all fair, and took a great dislike to Betsy, which Betsy heartily returned. At last matters became so bad that in their efforts to get at each other, they half kicked the stable to pieces, and would even rear themselves upon their hind legs in order to bite each other's faces. Théophile did all he could to make them friends, but nothing was of any use, and at last he was forced to sell Betsy. The horse he found to replace her was a shade lighter in color, and therefore not quite so good a match, but luckily Jane took to her at once, and lost no time in doing the honors of the stable. Every day the affection between the two became greater. Jane would lay her head on Blanche's shoulder. She had been called Blanche because of her fair skin, and when they were turned out into the stable yard, after being rubbed down, they played together like two kittens. If one was taken out alone, the other became sad and gloomy, till the well-known tread of its friend's hoofs was heard from afar, when it would give a joyful neigh, which was instantly answered. Never once was it necessary for the coachman to complain of any difficulty in harnessing them. They walked themselves into their proper places, and behaved in all ways as if they were well brought up, and ready to be friendly with everybody. They had all kinds of pretty little ways, and if they thought there was a chance of getting bread or sugar or melon rind, which they both loved, they would make themselves as caressing as a dog. Jane is surrounded by imaginary ghosts and monsters. Blanche telling ghost stories to Jane in the stable. Nobody who has lived much with animals can doubt that they talk together in a language that man is too stupid to understand. Or, if anyone had doubted it, they would soon have been convinced of the fact by the conduct of Jane and Blanche when in harness. When Jane first made Blanche's acquaintance, she was afraid of nothing. But after they had been together a few months, her character gradually changed, and she had sudden panics and nervous fits, which puzzled her master greatly. The reason of this was that Blanche, who was very timid and easily frightened, passed most of the night in telling Jane ghost stories, till poor Jane learnt to tremble at every sound. Often, when they were driving in the lonely alleys of the Bois de Boulogne after dark, Blanche would come to a dead stop, or shy to one side, as if a ghost, which no one else could see, stood before her. She breathed loudly, trembled all over with fear, and broke out into a cold perspiration. No efforts of Jane, strong though she was, could drag her along. The only way to move her was for the coachman to dismount and to lead her, with his hand over her eyes for a few steps, till the vision seemed to have melted into air. In the end, these terrors affected Jane, just as if Blanche, on reaching the stable, had told her some terrible story of what she had seen, and even her master had been known to confess that, when driving by moonlight down some dark road, where the trees cast strange shadows, Blanche would suddenly come to a dead halt and begin to tremble. He did not half like it himself. With this one drawback, never were animals so charming to drive. If Théophile held the reins, it was really only for the look of the thing, and not in the least because it was necessary. The smallest click of the tongue was enough to direct them, to quicken them, to make them go to the right or to the left, or even to stop them. They were so clever that in a very short time they had learned all their master's habits, and knew his daily haunts as well as he did himself. They would go of their own accord to the newspaper office, to the printing office, to the publishers, to the Bois de Boulogne, to certain houses where he dined on certain days in the week, so very punctually that it was quite provoking. And if it ever happened that Théophile spent longer than usual at any particular place, they never failed to call his attention by loud neighs, or by pawing the ground, sounds of which he quite well knew the meaning. But alas, the time came when a revolution broke out in Paris. People had no time to buy books or to read them. They were far too busy in building barricades across the streets, or in tearing up the paving stones to throw at each other. The newspaper in which Théophile wrote, and which paid him enough money to keep his horses, did not appear any more. And sad though he was at parting, the poor man thought he was lucky to find someone to buy horses, carriage, and harness for a fourth part of their worth. Tears stood in his eyes as they were led away to their new stable, but he never forgot them, and they never forgot him. Sometimes, as he sat writing at his table, he would hear from afar a light, quick step, and then a sudden stop under the windows. And their old master would look up and sigh, and say to himself, "Poor Jane, poor Blanche, I hope they are happy." End of chapter 30. Recording by Lynn Jarrow.
Section 31 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tanya Kay. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Madame Théophile and the Parrot. After the death of Cagnotte, whose story you may have read, Théophile was so unhappy that he would not have another dog, but instead determined to fill the empty place in his heart with cats. One of those that he loved the best was a big yellowy red puss with a white chest, a pink nose, and blue eyes, that went by the name of Madame Théophile, because when he was in the house, it never left his side for a single instant. It slept on his bed, dreamed while sitting on the arm of Théophile's chair while he was writing, for Théophile was by this time almost a grown-up man, walked after him when he went into the garden, sat by his side while he had his dinner, and sometimes took, gently and politely, the food he was conveying to his own mouth. One day a friend of Théophile's, who was leaving Paris for a few days, brought a parrot, which he begged Théophile to take care of while he was away. The bird, not feeling at home in this strange place, climbed up to the top of his cage and looked around him with his funny eyes that reminded you of the nails in the sofa. Now, Madame Théophile had never seen a parrot, and it was plain that this curious creature gave her a shock. She sat quite still, staring quietly at the parrot, and trying to think if she had ever seen anything like it among the gardens and roofs of the houses where she got all her ideas of the world. At last she seemed to make up her mind. Of course it must be a kind of green chicken. Having set the question at rest, Madame Théophile jumped down from the table where she had been seated while she made her observations, and walked quickly to the corner of the room, where she laid herself flat down, with her head bent and her paws stretched out like a panther watching his prey. The parrot followed all her movements with his round eyes, and felt that they meant no good to him. He ruffled his feathers, pulled at his chain, lifted one of his paws in a nervous way, and rubbed his beak up and down his food tin. All the while the cat's blue eyes were talking in a language the parrot clearly understood, and they said, "Although it is green, that fowl would make a nice dinner." But Madame Théophile had not lain still all this while. Slowly, without even appearing to move, she had drawn closer and closer. Her pink nostrils trembled, her eyes were half shut, her claws were pushed out and pulled into their sheaths, and little shivers ran down her back. Suddenly her back rounded itself like a bow, and with one bound she leapt on the cage. The parrot knew his danger and was too frightened to move. Then, calling up all his courage, he looked his enemy full in the face, and in a low and deep voice he put the question, "Jackie, did you have a good breakfast?" This simple phrase struck terror into the heart of the cat, who made a spring backwards. If a cannon had been fired close to her ear, or a shop full of glass had been broken, she could not have been more alarmed. Never had she dreamed of anything like this. "And what did you have? Some of the king's roast beef?" continued the parrot. "It is not a chicken, it is a man that is speaking," thought the cat with amazement, and looking at her master, who was standing by, she retired under the bed. Madame Théophile knew when she was beaten. End of section 31. Recording by Tanya K.
Section 32 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Campbell Shelp. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 32, The Battle of the Mullets and the Dolphins, by Mrs. Lang. Many singular stories may be found in Pliny, but the most interesting is how men and dolphins combined together on the coast of France, near Narbonne, to catch the swarms of mullet that come into those waters at certain seasons of the year. In Languedoc, within the province of Narbonne, there is a standing pool or dead water called La Terre, wherein men and dolphins together used to fish. For at one certain time of the year an infinite number of fishes called mullets, taking the vantage of the tide when the water doth ebb, at certain narrow weirs and passages with great force break forth of the said pool into the sea. And by reason of that violence no nets can be set and pitched against them strong enough to abide and bear their huge weight and the stream of the water together. if so be men were not cunning and crafty to wait and espy their time, and lay for them and to entrap them. In like manner, the mullets, for their part, immediately make speed to recover the deep, which they do very soon by reason that the channel is near at hand, and their only haste is for this, to escape and pass that narrow place which affordeth opportunities to the fishers to stretch out and spread their nets. The fishermen being ware thereof, and all the people besides, for the multitude knowing when fishing time is come, run thither, and the rather for to see the pleasant sport, cry as loud as ever they can to the dolphins for aid, and call, Simo, Simo, to help to make an end of this their game and pastime of fishing. The dolphins soon get the ear of their cry, and know what they would have, and the better if the north winds blow and carry the sound unto them. For if it be a southern wind, it is later ere the voice be heard, because it is against them. Howbeit, be the wind in what quarter soever, the dolphins resort thither flock-meal, sooner than a man would think, for to assist them in their fishing. And a wondrous pleasant sight it is to behold the squadrons, as it were, of those dolphins, how quickly they take their places and be arranged in battle array, even against the very mouth of the said pool, where the mullets are to shoot into the sea, to see, I say, how from the sea they oppose themselves and fight against them and drive the mullets, once frightened and scared, from the deep on the shelves. Then come the fishers and beset them with net and toil, which they bear up and fortify with strong forks. Howbeit, for all that, the mullets are so quick and nimble that a number of them whip over, get away, and escape the nets. But the dolphins are ready to receive them, who, contenting themselves for the present to kill only, make foul work and havoc among them, and put off the time of preying and feeding upon, until they have ended the battle and achieved the victory. And now the skirmish is hot, for the dolphins, perceiving also the men at work, are the more eager and courageous in fight, taking pleasure to be enclosed within the nets, and so most valiantly charging upon the mullets, but for fear lest the same should give an occasion unto the enemies, and provoke them to retire and fly back between the boats, the nets, and the men there swimming, they glide by so gently and easily that it cannot be seen where they get out, and albeit they take great delight in leaping, and have the cast of it, yet none essayeth to get forth but where the nets lie under them. But no sooner are they out, but presently a man shall see brave pastime between them as they scuffle and skirmish as it were under the ramparts. And so the conflict being ended and all the fishing sport done, the dolphins fall to spoil and eat those which they killed in the first shock and encounter. But after this service performed, the dolphins retire not presently into the deep again, from whence they were called, but stay until tomorrow, as if they knew very well they had so carried themselves as that they deserved a better reward than one day's refection and victuals, and therefore contented they are not, and satisfied unless to their fish they have some sops and crumbs of bread given them soaked in wine, and had their bellies full. End of section 32.
Section 33 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marilyn Rakes. The Animal Storybook. Edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 33, Monkey Stories, by Mrs. Lang. Monkey Stories. Before telling you more stories about monkeys, we must tell you some dry facts about them, in order that you may understand the stories. There are three different kinds of monkeys: apes, baboons, and monkeys proper. The difference is principally in their tails, so that when you see them at the zoo, for there are none wild in Europe except at Gibraltar, you will know them by the apes having no tails and walking upright, baboons have short tails and go on all fours, and monkeys have tails sometime larger than their whole bodies, by which they can swing themselves from tree to tree. Apes and monkeys are so ready to imitate everything which men do, that the Negroes believe that they are a lazy race of men, who will not be at the trouble to work. Baboons, on the contrary, can be taught almost nothing. There are two kinds of apes, called orang-utans and chimpanzees. They are both very wild and fierce, and difficult to catch, but when caught, become not only tame, but very affectionate, and can be taught anything. Nearly 200 years ago, in 1698, one was brought to London that had been caught in Angola. On board ship he became very fond of the people who took care of him, and was very gentle and affectionate, but would have nothing to do with some monkeys who were on the same ship. He had had a suit of clothes made for him, probably to keep him warm. As the ship got into colder regions, he took great pleasure in dressing himself in them, and anything he could not put on for himself he used to bring in his paw to one of the sailors, and seemed to ask him to dress him. He had a bed to sleep in, and at night used to put his head on the pillow and tuck himself in like a human being. His story is unfortunately a short one, for he died soon after coming to London. He could not long survive the change from his native forest to the cage of a menagerie. 2 orang-utans. Another, a female, was brought to Holland nearly 100 years later, in 1776, but she too pined and died after 7 months' captivity. She was very gentle and affectionate, and became so fond of her keeper that when they left her alone, she used to throw herself on the ground screaming, and tearing in pieces anything in her reach, just like a naughty child. She could behave as well as any lady in the land when she liked. When asked out to tea, she used to bring a cup and saucer, put sugar in the cup, pour out the tea, and leave it to cool. And at dinner her manners were just as good. She used her knife and fork, table napkin, and even toothpick, as if she had been accustomed to them all her life, which, of course, in her native forest was far from being the case. She learned all her nice habits either from watching people at table or from her keeper's orders. She was fond of strawberries, which she ate very daintily on a fork, holding the plate in the other hand. She was particularly fond of wine, and drank it like a human being, holding the glass in her hand. She was better behaved than 2 other orang-utans, who, though they could behave as well at table as any lady, and could use their knives and forks and glasses, and could make the cabin boy, for it was on board ship, understand what they wanted, yet, if he did not attend to them at once, they used to throw him down, seize him by the arm, and bite him. A French priest had an orang-utan that he had brought up from a baby, and who was so fond of his master that he used to follow him about like a dog. When the priest went to church, he used to lock the orang-utan up in a room, but one day he got out, and as sometimes happens with dogs who cannot get reconciled to Sunday, he followed his master to church. He managed, without the priest seeing him, to climb on the sounding board above the pulpit, where he lay quite still till the sermon began. He then crept forward till he could see his master in the pulpit below, and imitated every one of his movements, till the congregation could not keep from laughing. The priest thought they were making fun of him, and was naturally very angry. The more angry he became, the more gestures he used, every one of which the ape overhead repeated. At last a friend of the priest stood up in the congregation and pointed out the real culprit. When the priest looked up and saw the imitation of himself, he could not keep from laughing either, and the service could not go on till the disturber had been taken down and locked up again at home. Another kind is called the Barbary ape. because they are found in such numbers in Barbary that the trees in places seem nearly covered with them, though there are quantities as well in India and Arabia. They are very mischievous and great fighters. In India, the natives sometimes amuse themselves by getting up a fight among them. They put down at a little distance from each other baskets of rice, with stout sticks by each basket, and then they go off and hide themselves among the trees to watch the fun. The apes come down from the trees in great numbers, and make as though they were going to attack the baskets, but lose courage and draw back, grinning at each other. The females are generally the boldest, and the first to seize on the food, but as soon as they put their heads down to eat, some of the males set to drive them off. Others attack them in their turn. They all seize on the sticks, and soon a free fight begins, which ends in the weakest being driven off into the woods, and the conquerors enjoying the spoil. They are not only fierce, but revengeful, and will punish severely any person who kills one of them. Some English people who were driving through a country full of these apes in the East Indies wished, out of sheer wantonness, to have one shot. The native servants, knowing what the consequences would be, were afraid, but as their masters insisted, they had to obey, and shot a female whose little ones were clinging to her neck. She fell dead from the branches, and the little ones, falling with her, were killed too. Immediately all the other apes, to the number of about 60, came down and attacked the carriage. They would certainly have killed the travelers if the servants, of whom there was fortunately a number, had not driven the apes off, and though the carriage set off as fast as the horses could lay legs to the ground, the apes followed for 3 miles. The baboons who stole the poor man's dinner. Baboons are as ugly, revolting creatures as you could wish to see, and very fierce, so they can seldom be tamed, nor even caught. There are, of course, few stories about them. When people try to catch them, they let their pursuers come so near that they think they have them, and then they bound away 10 paces at once and look down defiantly from the treetop, as much as to say, "Don't you wish you may get me?" One baboon had so wearied his pursuers by his antics that they pointed a gun at him, though with no intention of firing. He had evidently seen a gun before and knew its consequences, and was so frightened at the bare idea that he fell down senseless and was easily captured. When he came to himself again, he struggled so fiercely that they had to tie his paws together, and then he bit so that they had to tie his jaws up. Baboons are great thieves, and come down from the mountains in great bodies to plunder gardens. They cram as much fruit as they possibly can into their cheek pouches to take away and eat afterwards at their leisure. They always set a sentinel to give the alarm. When he sees anyone coming, he gives a yell that lasts a minute, and then the whole troop sets off helter-skelter. They will rob anyone they come upon alone in the most impudent way. They come softly up behind, snatch away anything they can lay their hands on, and then run off a little way and sit down. Very often it is the poor man's dinner that they devour before his eyes. Sometimes they will hold it out in their hands and pretend they are going to give it back, in such a comic way that I would defy you not to laugh, though it were your own dinner that had been snatched away and then offered to you. Monkeys live in the tree-tops of the forests of India and South Africa, where they keep up a constant chattering and gambolling, all night as well as all day, playing games and swinging by their tails from tree to tree. One kind, the 4-fingered monkey, can pass from one high tree-top to another, too far even for a monkey to jump, by making themselves into a chain joined to each other by their tails. They can even cross rivers in this way. There are any number of different kinds of monkeys, as you can see any day in the monkey house at the zoo. One kind is well named the howling monkey, because they howl in chorus every morning 2 hours before daylight and again at nightfall. The noise they make is so fearful that if you did not know, you would think it was a forest full of ferocious beasts quite near, thirsting for their prey, instead of harmless monkeys a mile or 2 away. There is always a leader of the chorus who sits on a high branch above the others. He first howls a solo, and then gives a signal for the others to join in. Then they all howl together, till he gives another signal to stop. The egret monkeys are great thieves. When they set to work to rob a field of millet, they put as many stalks as they can carry in their mouths, in each paw and under each arm, and then go off home on their hind legs. If pursued and obliged for greater speed to go on all their 4 legs, they drop what they carry in their paws, but never let go what they have in their mouths. The Chinese monkey is also a great thief, and even cleverer about carrying away his booty. They always set a sentinel on a high tree. When he sees anyone coming, he screams, "Whoop, whoop, whoop." The others then seize as much as they can carry in their right arm and set off on 3 legs. They are called Chinese, not because they come from China, but because the way the hair grows on their heads is like a Chinese cap. It is long and parts in the middle, spreading out all around. In many parts of India, monkeys are worshipped by the natives, and temples are erected for them. But monkeys of one tribe are never allowed to come into any of these sanctuaries when another tribe is already in possession. A large, strong monkey was once seen by some travelers to steal into one of these temples. As soon as the inhabitants saw that he did not belong to their tribe, they set on him to drive him out. As he was only one against many, though bigger and stronger than the others, he saw that he had no chance, and bounded up to the top, 11 stories high. As the temple ended in a little round dome just big enough for himself, he was master of the situation, and every monkey that ventured to climb up he flung down to the bottom. When this had happened 3 or 4 times, his enemies thought it best to let him alone, and he stayed there in peace till it was dark and he could slip away unseen. End of chapter 33.
Section 34 of the Animal Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. The Animal Story Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Eccentric Bird Builders by Mr. Jonas. Eccentric Bird Builders, from Jones's Glimpses of Animal Life. Everybody knows how fond birds are of building their nests in church, and if we come to think of it, it is a very reasonable and sensible proceeding. Churches are so quiet, and have so many dark, out-of-the-way corners, where no one would dream of poking, certainly not the woman whose business it is to keep the church clean. So the birds have the satisfaction of feeling that their young are kept safe and warm while they are collecting food for them, and there is always some open door or window to enable the parents to fly in or out. But all birds have not the wisdom of the robins and swallows and sparrows, that they have selected the church for a home. And some of them have chosen very odd places indeed, wherein to build their nests and lay their eggs. Hinges of doors, turning lathes, even the body of a dead owl hung to a ring, have all been used as nurseries. But perhaps the oddest spot of all to fix upon for a nest is the outside of a railway carriage, especially when we remember how often railway stations are the abode of cats, who move safely about the big wheels, and even travel by train when they think it necessary. Yet in spite of all the drawbacks, railway carriages remain a favorite place for nesting birds, and there is a curious story of a pair of water wagtails which built a snug home underneath a third-class carriage attached to a train that ran 4 times daily between Cosham and Havant. The father does not seem to have cared about railway travelling, which, to be sure, must appear a wretched way of getting about to anything that has wings, for he never went with the family himself, but spent the time of their absence fluttering restlessly about the platform to which the train would return. He was so plainly anxious and unhappy about them, that one would have expected that he would have insisted on some quieter and safer place the following year, when nesting time came round again. but the mother apparently felt that the situation had some very distinct advantages, for she deliberately passed over every other spot that her mate pointed out, and went back to her third-class carriage. Yet a railway carriage seems safety itself in comparison with a London street lamp, where a fly-catcher's nest was found a few years ago. Composed as it was of moss, hair, and dried grass, it is astonishing that it never caught fire, but no doubt the great heat of the gas was an immense help in hatching the 5 eggs which the birds had laid. Those fly-catchers had built in a hollow iron ornament on the top of the lamp, but some tomtits are actually known to have chosen such a dangerous place as the spot close to the burner of a paraffin street lamp. And even when the paraffin was exchanged for gas, the birds did not seem to mind, and would sit calmly on the nest while the lamplighter thrust his long stick past them to put out the light. Birds reason in a different way from human beings, for a letter-box would not commend itself to us as being a very good place to bring up a family, with letters and packages tumbling onto their heads every instant. A pair of Scotch tomtits, however, thought otherwise, and they made a comfortable little nest at the back of a private letter-box, nailed on to the trunk of a tree in Dumfriesshire. The postman soon found out what was going on, but he took great pains not to disturb them, for he was fond of birds, and was very curious to see what the tomtits would do. What the tomtits did was to go peacefully on with their nest, minding their own business, and by 8 little eggs lay in the nest. By this time the mother had got so used to the postman that she never even moved when he unlocked the door, only giving his hand a friendly peck when he put it in to take out the letters, and occasionally accepting some crumbs which he held out to it. But no sooner did the little birds break through their shells than the parents became more difficult to deal with. They did not mind knocks from letters for themselves, but they grew furiously angry if the young ones ever were touched by so much as a corner, and one day, when a letter happened to fall plump on top of the nest, they tore it right to pieces. In fact, it was in such a condition that when the postman came as usual to make his collection, he was obliged to take the letter back to the people who had written it, for no post office would have sent it off in such a state. End of section 34.
Section 35 of the Animal Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Animal Storybook, edited by Andrew Lang. The Ship of the Desert, from Burckhardt's Travels in Nubia. Of all animals under the sun, perhaps the very ugliest is the camel. But life in the deserts of Africa and Arabia could not go on at all without the constant presence of this clumsy-looking creature. Some African tribes keep camels entirely for the use of their milk and flesh, and it is noticeable that these animals are much shyer and more timid than their brothers in Syria and Arabia, who will instantly come trotting up to any fresh camel that appears on the scene, or obey the call of any Bedouin, even if he is a stranger. In general, the camel is merely employed as a beast of burden, and from this he gets his name of the Ship of the Desert. Like other ships, he sways from side to side, and his awkward motion is apt to make his rider feel very sick till he gets accustomed to this way of traveling. Camels are wonderfully strong and enduring animals, and can stow up water within them for several days, besides having an extraordinary power of smelling any water or spring that is far beyond the reach of man's eyes. These qualities are naturally very valuable in the burning deserts, which stretch unbroken for hundreds of miles, where everything looks alike, and the sun, as he passes across the heaven, is the traveler's only guide. Partly from fear of warlike tribes which wander through the deserts of Arabia and Nubia, and partly from the help and protection which a large body can give the one to the other, It is the custom for merchants and travelers to band together and travel in great caravans of men and camels. They try, if possible, to find some well by which they can encamp, and every man fills his own skins with water before starting afresh on his journey. More quarrels arise about water than people who live in countries with plenty of streams and rivers can have any idea of. One man will sell his skinful to another at a very high price, while if a traveler thinks he will be very prudent and lay in a large store, the rest are certain to take it from him directly their own supply runs short. Foods they can do without on those burning plains, but not water. Some of these misfortunes befell a traveler of the name of Burckhardt, who left Switzerland in the opening years of this century, to pass several years in Africa and the East. After going through Syria, he began to make his way up the Nile, and even penetrated as far as Nubia, joining for that purpose a caravan of traders under the leadership of a Abade, an Arab race who from the earliest days have been acknowledged to be the best guides across the desert. Owing to the intense heat which prevails in those countries, the marches always take place in the small hours of the morning, and midnight seems to have been the usual hour for the start. Very commonly the march would continue for 11 hours, during which time the men were only allowed to drink twice, while the asses, who with the camels form part of the caravan, were put on half their allowance. Sometimes a detachment was sent on to wells that were known to lie along the route, to get everything ready for the rest when they came up, but it often happened that the springs were so choked up by drifting sand that no amount of digging would free them. Then there was nothing for it but to go on again. It's in the month of March that Burckhardt and his companions had their hardest experience of the dreadful desert thirst. The year had been drier than was common even in Nubia, and even in the little oases or fertile spots, most of the trees and acacias were withered and dead. Hour after hour the travelers toiled on, and soon the asses gave out, and their riders were forced to walk over the scorching sand. Burckhardt had been a little more careful of his stock of water than the other members of the caravan, and for some days had cooked no food or eaten anything but biscuits, so that he had been able to spare a draught every now and then for his own ass, and still had enough to last both of them for another day. However, it was quite clear that unless water was quickly found, they must all die together. And a council was held as to what was best to be done. The Abade chief's advice was, and always had been, to send out a company of 10 or 12 of the strongest camels to try to make their way secretly to the Nile, through the ranks of unfriendly Arab tribes encamped all along its eastern shore. This was agreed upon, and about 4 in the afternoon the little band set out, loaded with all the skins in the caravan. The river was a ride of 5 or 6 hours distant, so that many hours of dreadful suspense must pass before the watchers left behind could know what was to be their fate. Soon after sunset a few stragglers came in, who had strayed from the principal band, but they had not reached the river, and could give no news of the rest. As the night wore on, several of the traders came to Burckhardt to beg for a taste of the water he was believed to have stored up, but he had carefully hidden what remained, and only showed them his skins, which were empty. Then the camp gradually grew silent, and all sat and waited under the stars for the verdict of life or death. It was 3 in the morning when shouts were heard, and the camels, refreshed by deep draughts of the Nile water, came along at their utmost speed, bearing skins full enough for many days' journey. Only one man was missing, but traders are a cruel race, and these cared nothing about his fate, giving themselves up to feasting and song and joy at their deliverance. Yet only a year later, the fate that had almost overtaken them befell a small party of merchants who set out with their camels from Berber to Daro. The direct road, which led past the wells of Najim, was known to be haunted at that date by the celebrated robber Niam, who waylaid every caravan from Berber. So the merchants hired an Abadi guide to take them by a longer and more easterly road, where there was another well at which they could water. Unluckily, the guide knew nothing of the country that lay beyond, and the whole party soon lost themselves in the mountains. For 5 days they wandered about, not seeing a creature who could give them help, or even direct them to the right path. Then, their water being quite exhausted, they turned steadily westwards, hoping by this means soon to reach the Nile. But the river at this point takes a wide bend, and was, if they had known it, further from them than before. And after 2 days of dreadful agony, 15 slaves and 1 merchant died. In desperation, another merchant, who was an Abadi and owner of 10 camels, had himself lashed firmly onto the back of the strongest beast, lest in his weakness he should fall off, and then ordered the whole herd to be turned loose, thinking that perhaps the instinct of the animals would succeed where the knowledge of man had failed. But neither the Abade nor his camels were ever seen again. The merchant struggled forwards, and 8 days after leaving the well of Owarek, they arrived in sight of some mountains which they knew. But it was too late, and camels and merchants sank down helpless where they lay. They had just strength to gasp out orders for 2 of their servants to make their way on camels to the mountains where water would be found. But long before the mountains were reached, one of the men dropped off his camel, and, unable to speak, waved his hands in farewell to his comrade. The other mechanically rode on, but his eyes grew dim and his head dizzy, and well though he knew the road, he suffered his camel to wander from it. After straying aimlessly for some time, he dismounted and lay down in the shade of a tree to rest, first tying his camel to one of the branches. But a sudden puff of wind brought the smell of water to the camel's nostrils, and with a furious bound he broke the noose and galloped violently forward, and in half an hour was sucking in deep draughts from a clear spring. The man, understanding the meaning of the camel's rush, rode up and staggered a few steps after him, but fell to the ground from sheer weakness. Just at that moment a wandering Bedouin from a neighboring camp happened to pass that way, and seeing that the man still breathed, dashed water in his face, and soon revived him. Then, laden with skins of water, the 2 men set out for those left behind, and hopeless though their search seemed to be, they found they had arrived in time, and were able to save them from a frightful death. End of section 35.